For the first in my hopefully lengthy series, reviewing episodes of the classic Twilight Zone, I've selected my personal favorite. A lot of people think the Twilight Zone was a show that fixated solely on science fiction concepts, but that wasn't the case. While some of the more memorable episodes involved such sci-fi concepts as extraterrestrials, space travel, and time slips, a great many of them dealt with more supernatural and paranormal ideas. This is one of those episodes. The Howling Man by Charles Beaumont. The story begins with a bewildered older man looking directly at us, the audience, and he is trying to tell us something. Something that he knows we probably won't believe, but pleads with us to hear his story and tells us that we must believe him. This, I have to say, is very unusual for television at this time. Most people at home in 1960 weren't used to a character in a drama or fiction show looking directly at them, the way the friendly news anchors gave the nightly news every night. We are now part of the story. We don't know who we are in the story, but we're in it. We've been sucked into the narrative right from the get-go. The man tells us that the story begins many years ago, shortly after the First World War. He was on what he calls a walking trip through Central Europe when he got lost in a savage thunderstorm. The scene shifts, and we see an old castle barely visible in the storm. The castle's design doesn't suggest anything in particular, but given that the nearby village is mentioned as being called Schwarzwald, we can assume that this is somewhere in Germany. The castle is later identified as Castle Wolfring, which is another Germanic-sounding name. The Germanic-sounding locations will make more subtle sense by the end of the story. The man finds a door and pounds on it. While the initial version we saw of this man had a warbly, addled voice, this version of the man, also played by the same actor, H.M. Wynette, has a slightly younger and more vibrant voice, despite suffering from pneumonia thanks to being caught in the storm. The man is greeted by a strange-looking man who looks like the Charlton Heston version of Moses, complete with long hair, a large beard, and a shepherd hook staff. The man has a strange accent, but does speak English. The brusque shepherd tells the coughing, shivering man that visitors aren't allowed in the hermitage. The man pleads with him that he's lost and just needs to get out of the storm. The bearded man shrugs and lets him in. The man enters the main hall, and several similarly dressed men come out of the small rooms to observe him. One of the things one notices about this episode is that the camera angle often tilts to give us a diagonal view. This, I believe, is meant to help represent the man's disoriented and feverish condition. He is having balance issues, and we're kind of seeing what he's feeling as the camera tilts. This technique was also used in the Adam West Burt Ward Batman TV series later in the decade to simulate some of the angles one can find on comic book pages, and of course, Star Trek would violently tilt the camera while actors would lurch in unison to simulate ship collisions and maneuvers. While waiting in this main hall, the feverish man hears an intensely loud howling sound. It's not the kind of sound a man would make, at least not naturally. Strangely, he also seems to be the only one who can hear it. The doorman then approaches and tells him that Brother Jerome will see him now, and we are treated to John Carradine playing this Hermit Order's leader. He looks even more like Charlton Heston's Moses than anyone else. John Carradine, by the way, was always old as far as I'm concerned. Every movie or TV series I've seen him in, he was always this old. Imagine my shock when I found pictures of him as a younger man. He was a character actor known mostly for horror films, westerns, and Shakespearean theater. Brother Jerome asks the man his name, and the man introduces himself as David Ellington, and asks if he can spend the night and wait out the storm. Brother Jerome sternly tells him not only does he have to leave, but he has to leave right now. Throughout this exchange, we can hear the strange howls again, a sound that none of the hermits seem to notice. Ellington, having been told in no uncertain terms that he must go back out into the thunderstorm in his sick condition, tries to make his way to the door, but collapses before getting there. At this point, Twilight Zone creator Rod Serling appears and gives his usual kind of introduction. the prostrate form of Mr. David Ellington, scholar, seeker of truth, and, regrettably, finder of truth. A man who will shortly arise from his exhaustion to confront a problem that has tormented mankind since the beginning of time. A man who knocked on a door seeking sanctuary, and found instead the outer edges of the Twilight Zone. When we come back from commercial break, Ellington is back on his feet, but is still in the main hall. I do want to take a moment to talk about this set for the castle. While it is probably some stock set that they had at MGM, they really make it work here. You wouldn't be surprised to see Bela Lugosi or Boris Karloff step out from the shadows here. Ellington follows the strange howls to a cell door, where he finds the source, a man dressed in rags, desperate to be released. In contrast to the strange howling sound that he's been making all this time, the man in the cell is not only surprisingly articulate, but soft-spoken and eloquent. He keeps begging Ellington to let him out of the cell and repeatedly pleads with him in the name of mercy. The howling man then tells Ellington that Brother Jerome and all of the hermits are insane, and imprisoned him for kissing his wife in public down in the village of Schwarzwald. Brother Jerome then calls Ellington away from the cell and back into his office again to try to get him to leave the castle. Ellington, still dizzy and sweating, then asks Jerome about the man they've got locked up and asks if they have the authority to hold the man prisoner. Jerome's response is that there is no man being held at the hermitage. When Ellington then threatens to go to the village and tell the authorities, Brother Jerome relents and tells Ellington what's going on. Jerome declares that the person in the cell that Ellington spoke to earlier wasn't a man and was in fact the devil himself. Back from commercial break, Brother Jerome tells the story of how the village below refused to give in to the despair of the Great War, and their God-fearing happiness attracted Satan, who began a program of corruption. But Jerome recognized the devil and had him in a cell before he knew what happened. Ellington says, "If he's the devil, how do you keep him locked up?" Jerome replies triumphantly, "With the staff of truth." Now, the script originally had the hermits carrying staffs with crosses on them. Basically, they were in fact carrying crosses. The idea that they would put the cross on the door, and because the cross was a symbol of Christian salvation and Satan's defeat, he couldn't escape the door. Serling, however, knew that not all Christian viewers out there in 1960 would think this was a great idea, and so he modified and diluted the Christian elements of the story. The cross staffs were replaced with shepherd's hooks and renamed staves of truth. The hermits make no mention of God or Jesus Christ in the story, which I think is a shame. Ellington lies to Brother Jerome and says he believes his story, and so Brother Jerome says he can wait out the storm in the room of Brother Christophorus. That was the one who first answered the door for Ellington earlier in the episode. On his way to Christophorus's room, Ellington stops at the cell of the prisoner and tells him Jerome's story, to which the man in the cell laughs. Ellington says that in the morning he'll go to the authorities and tell them he's being held prisoner. The howling man says that the hermits would kill him if the authorities came to the castle. Ellington says he'll think of something and heads to Christophorus's room. Christophorus locks them both in the room for the night for their protection. Later, after Christophorus has fallen asleep, Ellington removes the key from the hermit's neck and grabs the cloak from a wall peg. Ellington comes to help the howling man, and he tells him to remove the wooden bolt. Ellington looks down and sees a simple staff holding the door shut and asks, "Is this all that holds you in?" To which the prisoner says, "Yes, hurry." To which Ellington says, "But why haven't you done it yourself?" It was established earlier that the prisoner could fit his whole arm through the window earlier, so he should have been able to free himself. Before Ellington can fully process the situation, keep in mind he's still rather sick, the prisoner impatiently tells him to remove the staff. Ellington does so, and once released, the man in rags incapacitates Ellington and begins a transformation. The first special effect here is one of the oldest tricks never used once everything went to color. The actor's appearance changes before our eyes, and his face goes from being a kindly one to an evil one. Even his eyes change. This wasn't done with a jump cut or time-lapse photography. This happens right before our eyes. The secret is that the actor is actually wearing the evil makeup the entire time, but at the beginning of the shot, we can't see it because the actor is being lit by a different colored light, probably red. We can't see that it's a red light because this is a black and white production. Because the light is red and the makeup he is wearing is also red, we can't see the makeup either. Gradually, the light shifts from a red light to a green light. In the green light, the red makeup becomes visible and darkens. It's a simple effect that's been around ever since the Frederick March Jekyll and Hyde movie from 1931. The next effect is when the devil finishes his transformation. This was done with jump cuts as he passes each of the pillars, changing a little bit each time he passes one. The devil then turns and faces the shocked David Ellington and vanishes in a puff of smoke. Brother Jerome then tries to comfort Ellington, but tells him that he truly pities him because for the rest of his life he'll know what he has unleashed upon the world. We then cut to the scene the story started with, and we see that Ellington, once again an older man, is telling this story to his housekeeper. He states that because of his mistake, he is responsible for the Second World War, a correlation perhaps to the story taking place in Germany, and later the Korean War. But after many years, he was able to reacquire the devil, and he now has him locked in the closet. We can see behind him that the closet has a small staff of truth barring the door. Ellington tells his housekeeper that he has to make preparations to return him to Brother Jerome and that he will be back. He tells her desperately not to open the door and to ignore the howling. He leaves, and the housekeeper hears the howl. The episode ends with her removing the tiny staff from the door. We then hear Rod Serling's closing remarks. Ancient folk saying, "You can catch the devil, but you can't hold him long. Ask Brother Jerome. Ask David Ellington. They know, and they'll go on knowing to the end of their days, and beyond, in the Twilight Zone." This episode is my favorite for not only the story, but for the great little performances contained within it, along with the overall production value. Like most episodes of the classic Twilight Zone, it's highly polished. If you can see it in high definition, particularly on Blu-ray, I highly recommend it. The transfer is absolutely stunning. It's sharp, crisp, and visually sumptuous on your high-definition screen. It looks way better than what the people who tuned in back in 1959 got, to be sure. It's a perfectly constructed half hour of television. Well, 22 minutes of television without commercial breaks, that is. Now, this character, the devil, bears only a superficial resemblance to the figure depicted in the Bible. This version much more closely resembles the version that seeped into the pop culture consciousness thanks to vaudeville and early unanimated cartoons. The real devil, whether you're talking about Lucifer or perhaps Samael, is an angel, and as such could not be subdued or imprisoned by any man. That's not to say, hypothetically, the Most High couldn't have blessed the hermit's staves with this ability, but it's not expressly stated that this is the case in the story. Generally speaking, any fallen angel that isn't already chained by God is free to roam heaven and earth. In the Book of Job, the Satan is depicted making a wager with God in heaven, for example. The devil's final form in this episode is very much in keeping with the pop culture version that proliferated the 20th century in advertising and entertainment. The Howling Man is one of several episodes of The Twilight Zone written by Charles Beaumont, real name Charles Leroy Nutt. One of the reasons why his episodes are some of the best is perhaps because Charles Beaumont himself lived in the Twilight Zone. You see, Beaumont died in 1967 when he was 38 years old. He died of Alzheimer's. The man was aging prematurely throughout his adult life. In pictures taken in his 20s, he looked like a man in his 50s. His son said that on his deathbed, his 38-year-old father looked like a 95-year-old man. He said he looked 95 and was in fact 95 by every calendar except the one on your watch. I sometimes think about Beaumont's short life and how it must have been watching his friends stay young while he grew old and senile before even hitting middle age. Okay, speaking of writers, if you'd like to support this channel and help me make more videos, please share and subscribe, and also please consider buying a copy of my book, Captain Steel and Other Stories, on Amazon. If you like the kind of stories that the classic Twilight Zone featured, I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you for watching.